the utter insanity that the same people who basically ignored Khatami because the president of Iran is powerless and are now pretending that Ahmadinejad is a new Hitler and that Iran is 1939 Germany. Forget about how offensive that statement is. It's absurd. This is a very important point. If your sole source of information is the media, which is not in a position, nor does it want to be in a position, and I mean the popular media, not the Economist, of course.
Are you saying they're unpopular, Reza?
Yes. Not the archaic, arcane, media. No, I'm a lifetime member of The Economist. It's like all I read. So there's no way I would say anything about that. But the point is that if that's your sort of perspective, your source of information, it's not so much that the media is failing in its job. It's not its job. It's not its job to give us this nuanced, very boring conversation and debate taking place within the Muslim world. So there's no reason why you should know about this. But at the same time, I can't understand why the same people who are saying, well, why aren't Muslims standing up, to violence? Why aren't they trying to present some sort of ideological counterweight, and yet have no conception of, just in this country alone, the amazing work being done by the Council of American Islamic Relations, by the Zaytuna Institute, by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, by the American Society of Muslim Advancement, by the Islamic Society of North America, by the North American Fiqh Council, by the Muslim Public Affairs Council. There are dozens, the One Nation organization. There are dozens of organizations just in this country alone that are screaming at the top of their lungs to be heard in this shouting match taking place within the Muslim world. Frankly, if you can't hear it, then you're not listening.
Okay, well... Your turn.
Really? Already? Didn't have to wait very long, did I? I've got to challenge that last statement yet again. Reza, you have listed off the top of your head all kinds of organizations that you claim are doing amazing work. And they fail to be heard. And some of the work that they do, particularly One Nation, for example, is innovative and important. Zaytuna is another. But I have to say that what you've just said raises a much broader issue that is of great import to Americans, which is the difference between moderate Muslims, of which most of these organizations are a part, and reform-minded Muslims. We're also focused in this country on trying to distinguish between the extremists and the moderates. As Reza rightly pointed out, he and I and others like us are constantly bombarded with the question, where are the moderates? Well, the moderates are actually the establishment in America. And they're part of the problem. What really ought to be asked is, where are the reform-minded Muslims? Moderates denounce terror that is committed in the name of Islam, but they deny that Islam has anything to do with this violence. Reform-minded Muslims condemn Islamist violence and acknowledge that our religion is being used to help incite the violence that is committed in its name. When you often hear moderate Muslims insist that Islam has nothing to do with this, when they insist this, in effect, they abandon the ground of theological interpretation to those with malignant intentions. They wave a white symbolic flag, the universal symbol of capitulation, to those who are abusing Islam, because they're saying to terrorists of the Islamic variety that we as mainstream Muslims will not challenge you with bold, competing interpretations of the Quran. So you guys can walk away with the show. You get to define what Islam is in the popular discourse. Reform-minded Muslims, on the other hand, step up to the plate and insist that we've got to reinterpret the violent passages of the Quran in much the same way that liberal Christians have done with the violent passages in the Bible, and Reform Jews have done in the violent passages of the Old Testament. And reinterpreting does not mean rewriting. Let me be very clear about that. It means rethinking the words that already exist. And I can sincerely tell you that Islam not only permits such rethinking, it encourages it. There are 3 times as many verses in the Quran calling on us to think and analyze and reflect than verses that tell us what is absolutely right or wrong. And in that sense, reform-minded Muslims are as authentic as moderates are. But I would argue we are also much more constructive than moderates are. So at the end of the day, I would argue that the various organizations, most of the various organizations that Reza has reeled off, are giving, through their denial, giving the extremist elements a blank check. And maybe they're doing it out of fear. Maybe fear in part breeds denial. After all, reform-minded Muslims challenge the extremists and often pay for it with imprisonment, prolonged unemployment, and that's at the best of times. And as we know, sometimes with their lives.
Okay, I want to come back and talk a bit about the war on terror and the impact it's had, and to look at some of the points you made. I mean, obviously, you know, this is dangerous territory in New York to sort of make any attempt to defend the administration, but I come from Britain, so I guess I can feel slightly less dangerous trying to defend Tony Blair, or even that is actually a dangerous sport nowadays. But at least one of the motivations for going into Iraq was humanitarian. It was a sense in which there is a dictator representing a minority of the population, doing terrible things, killing routinely, chemical weapons against his own population, and that removing that person and replacing a government that was, broadly inspired by democracy, would actually be a step forward. And on the face of it, it seems that this is not something that the Iraqi people wanted, and that they are doing most of the killing of each other because of what seems on the face of it to be, a powerful split within Islam between the Sunnis and the Shias. And to what extent has that got anything to do with, American mistakes, with which there are obviously very many, in terms of how the occupation was done? Was it simply that they just removed a cork from a bottle in Iraq, and that allowed these sort of deep hatreds within Islam to unleash themselves on each other, and no administration, even one led by Bill Clinton, could have actually done any better, or even anyone, basically? This is a problem.
This is really interesting, because there's this wonderful narrative that's already being written in the American political establishment, both on the right and the left. And it is an answer to this question: how did Iraq go so wrong? How in the world did the Iraq War become such a monumental, apocalyptic failure? Well, the answer, I think, is pretty easy. It's the Iraqis' fault, of course. Everybody seems to agree with that. You see it on the right and the left. Charles Krauthammer wrote a very famous op-ed in the New York Times saying, essentially that, we gave the Iraqis a republic and they don't seem to be able to keep it. Those were his words. My senator, Barbara Boxer, about as liberal a senator as it gets in the U.S. Congress, recently said, quote, "We gave Iraqis their freedom. What are they choosing to do with their freedom? Kill each other."